It's really a great honor to be here and to be associated in any way with Project Censored, which I admire a lot. I'm not a journalist. I don't usually write articles. I really am a lawyer, and every day my staff and I go to work and we represent immigrant workers, and that's what we do across the South. But over the last couple years, as we listened to kind of the larger immigration debate in the world, the folks in my office and I were really struck by how narrow the range of debate was about these issues. And we kept hearing President Bush talk about the need for guest worker programs and the need for immigration reform and how that meant we needed to have guest worker programs. And we all said, we thought this was a pretty narrow range of debate, and that there certainly are other options and models for immigration reform besides guest worker programs. And by the way, we really know what guest worker programs look like in practice. And so that kind of motivated us to write this report, and we did bring copies of it, about the guest worker programs that already exist in the United States. And that's what I'm here to talk a little bit about tonight, because we have guest worker programs in the United States. And as this administration and maybe the next administration talks about the need for immigration reform, which I certainly think that we need, before people start talking about replicating guest worker programs on a kind of giant scale, as Bush was talking about, really filling millions of slots with guest workers over the next years when he was actually talking about immigration reform, we thought we should look in practice at what the programs we already have look like in the real world, and what they look like should give us pause. We have around 100,000 guest workers under the H-2 program in the United States every year. That has varied, fluctuated over the last 5 years quite a bit, but around 100,000 guest workers who come to the United States from other countries on temporary visas under the H-2A and H-2B programs. I have been working as a lawyer representing guest workers since 1990, when I graduated from law school. So I have spoken with literally thousands of guest workers in many states in the United States. Our report discusses in detail the kinds of abuses that workers experience. And here's what we see in practice in the real world. The abuses that guest workers suffer start long before they get to the United States. They start at the time of recruitment in their home countries. The majority of guest workers who come to the United States come from Mexico, though increasingly we see a fairly broad array of countries being represented. Lots of workers from Guatemala. We now represent a large number of workers from India. We've seen workers from Thailand, from Africa. And these are workers who are coming to fill short-term, low-wage jobs. By definition, the positions have to be temporary. And there are two programs. The H-2A program is for agricultural workers, and the H-2B program is for non-agricultural workers. And they permit the importation of human beings to the United States on a temporary basis to perform work in the U.S. upon the petition by a U.S. employer. The workers are permitted to enter the United States only at the request of a U.S. worker, and they are permitted to work only for the employer who petitions for them. They are also entitled to remain in the United States only so long as that employer permits them to remain. So, as you might expect, this gives an employer a fairly broad amount of power over a worker in making many decisions. And what we have said is that one should not look at this program, that we can point to fairly dramatic abuses. One should not look at this program and say, oh, this is the program that's really attracted some bad apple employers. That we hear that all the time. There's some bad apples giving the program a bad name. What I think is obvious from kind of a closer inquiry is that the problem in these programs are structural. The problems are structural, that workers, begin by being forced to borrow large amounts of money in their home country in order to get the jobs in the first place. It's quite typical that our clients from Guatemala will pay from $2,000 to $5,000 to get a job. From Asia, 10 as much as $20,000 to get a short-term, low-wage job. When they get to the United States, they're entitled to work only for the employer who petitioned for them. So if that doesn't work out, they don't like how it's going, they really don't have any options in practice. They can't legally go work anywhere else, and as a practical matter, they can't go home because they're badly in debt. Some of our clients have described owing thousands of dollars and paying as much as 20% per month interest on their debt, which is fairly crushing. The other sort of recruitment issues that we see are that workers are regularly required to leave collateral in their home country with someone, a recruiter, in order to assure their compliance with the contract in the United States. And so what we see, for example, in Guatemala, is that our clients are required to leave the deed to their home with someone in Guatemala in order to get the job to come to the United States. And people who can't do that are not hired. And so workers are in the United States, their spouse and children are living in that home, and they understand that if they don't do what they're supposed to do, that rightly, that their family is in trouble. This, I think it's easy to see that this is a system like a kind of old school indentured servitude. In many ways, in fact, it's worse than indentured servitude, because indentured servitude, historically, was a system that led to the right to remain in the United States. And guest worker programs don't do that. Guest worker programs are temporary visas, and so we have workers who are paying these fees to come back year after year after year, because this is really their only opportunity for employment in the United States. And they have the right to ask to have that job again, and that's really all they have the right to. They don't have a right to demand that job again. If they complain, if they're hurt on the job, if they file a lawsuit, they're certainly not going to be asked back. And they don't have the right to anything beyond that. They don't have the right to bring their families with them. They don't have the right, even if they've been coming 10 and 15 years, to just decide they like the United States and they want to stay here and work. So these are really positions that are owned by the employer in a very real way. What we see in practice is that workers are thus subjected to fairly dramatically illegal conditions all the time, and that workers don't complain about them. So we see that workers are underpaid. Workers are required to be paid something called either the adverse effect wage rate or the prevailing wage rate, depending on which program you're in. And what that is a wage rate that's set by the Department of Labor to say, this is the wage that will protect similarly situated U.S. workers. So we want to make sure that guest workers aren't eroding the wages of U.S. workers in the same industry. So the Department of Labor will just declare, based on some methodology that they have determined, that, for example, forestry workers in Alabama will this year earn $9.50. They can't be paid less than that. But what we see in practice is that workers are in fact paid less than that. Workers are often in fact paid less than the minimum wage, and that they get away with it. There's really no serious system of enforcement. The Department of Labor, in fact, has said said, in a press release after our report was issued, that they don't think that they even have the authority to enforce the prevailing wage. So they make you stamp something saying you're going to pay $9, but if you don't, then there's nothing they're really going to do about that. And in reality, workers are paid less than the minimum wage. Workers are often also subjected to other kinds of sort of wage treatment. One thing we see is that an employer, because they're not paying anything to get these workers, it doesn't cost them anything, they often bring them in a month before they actually need the workers, just to make sure that they're there and ready when the work starts up. So in a seasonal industry, like agriculture or tourism, you're not entirely sure when things are going to heat up. And it's nice to have people sort of sitting there ready. Well, these are workers who have borrowed a lot of money, who have a debt that they're paying, and they can't earn money anywhere else. And so they're just sitting there. So we see workers who are, have been sitting for 3 or 4 weeks and they haven't earned a penny. They have to pay on their debt and they're paying rent and they don't have any food. And so that's often the first time that we meet people, is that they call us and they say, like, is there a church? We don't have anything to eat. We're dying here. And there's really no incentive for employers to do it differently, because it doesn't cost them anything to have people sitting there. And so we see a lot of that in workers being lied to, workers being promised the moon, and then having nothing that they can really do about it. Other issues that workers face is that they work in dangerous industries. The industries that tend to import guest workers tend to be some of the more dangerous occupations in the United States. So people do get hurt. People get hurt on the job. And what we have in dealing with that, we have transnational workers and workers' compensation systems that are not transnational. And workers who are not entitled to remain here to pursue their workers' compensation claims. But in fact, after they're injured, if they're not working, they have to go back home. Legally, they have to go back to their home countries. So their ability to actually get any benefits for the injuries they experience is fairly minimal. And so we see people who are injured on the job and then really, like, literally taken to the bus station and told to go home the next day, and that's the end. And so in a very real way, we say these are disposable workers. They are workers literally who are useful to the employer for the time that they work, and then they can be thrown away. And it, programs structurally do something else kind of related to that, and that is because employers are kind of shopping the world for workers in a very real sense. They are able to discriminate in a way that would be unacceptable and clearly illegal in the United States. So many of the recruiters have very clear policies that, for example, we only hire men and we only hire people between the ages of 25 and 40. That's it. Those would clearly be unlawful criteria in the United States. But they are routinely applied in the context of these programs. And I'm sure if I was an employer, I would think this was fabulous too, to be able to sort of handpick the choicest of, brawny men to come and perform my arduous labor, and then, when they hit 41, to never call upon them again. But that's really the system that we have. And what we see increasingly, I think, as employers have gone to countries besides Mexico, is employers shopping countries. And they've said, I've heard employers say to me, we don't go to Mexico anymore. Those people complain too much. We find that the Guatemalans are much better. And it's not a coincidence, I think, that the place in Guatemala that employers go are the highlands where most people are indigenous Mayans and often don't speak very good Spanish, and certainly don't have any opportunities for paid employment. So the opportunity to come to the United States is highly valued for the workers there, and they're particularly vulnerable. And you see, if you sort of, as we were writing this, kind of Googling some of the H-2B recruiting agencies and employers, that they're really quite astonishing to watch people sort of describe the workers they're able to provide. Some of them describe, well, the Mexicans, they're very happy, agreeable people. We like them a lot. And sort of touting the various attributes of people from various countries and what makes them desirable. And it's really, in a very real sense, like ordering human beings from a catalog. I think that, one of the most common issues that we see with workers, and probably the most common call that we get, are from workers whose identity documents are seized by the employer. And that really means workers show up in the United States and the employer says, hand over your passport. I want to hold your passport. And that happens fairly routinely. When we call employers, they say, "Oh yeah, we were just keeping it, safe for them so they didn't lose it." But in one case where we did a deposition of the employer and we asked her about why she kept people's social security cards, she's like, "Well, if you give them their documents, they leave." And so she had, was quite candid in saying that this was a fairly, deliberate strategy to ensure that people do not leave. And I think this is when an abusive program has clearly crossed the line into kind of a systematized process of human trafficking with the imprimatur of the United States government. I mean, this is a very regulated program in which the United States government is involved in all aspects of the application and the processing up until the moment that the employee arrives in the United States. And then the United States government has no further interest in these workers. So along the lines, the employer is going to the Department of Labor, and they're going to the Department of Homeland Security, and they're going through these various processes, and all of the paperwork has to be done. Once the worker is here, that's the end, and there is no process of oversight or enforcement of the laws. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about one of the industries that we see, just to kind of give you an example of what workers do and what life is like as a guest worker in the United States. This is the memorial outside the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama. And this is a memorial designed by Maya Lin, and it's kind of the motto of the Southern Poverty Law Center. So I guess we feel like we'll probably be around for a while because there's still quite a bit of work to be done. So I'm going to talk a little bit about forestry workers in the United States. This is my project was created at the Southern Poverty Law Center about between 4 and 5 years ago. And one of the first projects that we took on was forestry workers in the South. And there were a number of reasons that became interested in forestry workers. So these are the prevailing wage rates. These are a couple years old, obviously, but these are the prevailing wage rates that I talked about that are set by the Department of Labor, as far as I can tell, fairly randomly, since the tree planting rate in Alabama went from something like $12 last year to $6.50 this year. We have no idea sort of how that came about. But these are, I'll tell you that in South Alabama, $9.20 an hour is actually better than the going rate. I mean, that's kind of an indictment of South Alabama, but there it is. And workers are supposed to get overtime when they work more than 40 hours, and these are very long days that people are working doing tree planting. So we became interested in this as something that cuts across the South. I know that people talk about tree planting and forestry, and they often think about the Northwest or Northern California, but really tree planting in the United States now, for lots of reasons, is a largely southern operation, and 80% of the tree planting that's going on in the United States is going on commercially in the South. And these are not what you think about as lovely bucolic forests. These are pine tree plantations, basically. They are loblolly pines that are planted in a very systematized way to benefit companies like International Paper and Georgia Pacific and Kimberly-Clark. So we've got over 20,000 forestry workers who are being certified each year to come to the United States to do this work in the South, and some up further north, but largely in the South. So we became interested in it because we are a southern-based organization, and we sort of looked at this, and the largest amount of acreage that's going on is going on in states that are right where we are. And this is one of our clients out there in the field. So you can see it's not really a forest. He's walking in the brush, and he's got pine trees in a sack on his back. And virtually everyone who does this work is a guest worker. It's very seasonal work, and it's physically grueling work. And people have to travel each week. It's not, you can't live in one location and be a tree planter. And so people are moving from location to location. So it's really, in a lot of ways, a fairly undesirable job unless the pay was great. So what workers are actually doing is they take a tool, it's either called a hodad or a dibble bar, and they swing it over their heads and make a hole in the earth, take a tree out, plant it, put earth on it, and tamp it down. They are expected to plant 2,000 trees in a day. And they're typically paid around $25 per 1,000 trees planted. You can see that, I mean, this is actually a group of our clients who took this picture. You can see that some days that would be real hard. And you know, people would ask, can you really plant 2,000 trees? And people would say, sometimes, yeah. If conditions are ideal and you kill yourself, yes, you may be able to do that. But lots of times the site hasn't been well prepared. There's debris, there's raining, and you can see these workers actually worked on this day in the mud, although they thought it was bad enough that they did take a picture of it. And they live largely in fairly bad motels across the rural South from week to week. Generally, they're paying for it, and they don't have cooking facilities, which is really a major issue for a lot of workers because it ends up being, then quite expensive. People spend more than they would like on food, and the fact that they're moving so regularly means that they can't kind of invest in any kinds of, go to a store and buy a lot of food and, invest in some sort of infrastructure to keep food or cook it. So. And people do move around quite a lot. One of the challenges for us as an organization that's going out and talking to people is that we find workers, they're interested in talking to us, and they're here in the Sands Motel in Meridian, Mississippi, and then 2 weeks later they call us and they're, in Arkansas or some other place. This is a paycheck from one of our actual clients who he was actually the named plaintiff in a lawsuit that we filed against a company called Express Forestry. And this client, we looked at his paycheck, and it looked okay. I mean, he has 27 hours here, and he planted 9,900 trees in a week. And we did the math. He was working in Arkansas that week, and he earned between $8 and $9 an hour, and that came out to almost exactly the prevailing wage rate. So he earned $247.50 for his 27 hours of work. But when we started to talk to him in detail about what he did each and every day of this week, what we found is that he hadn't worked 27 hours. He'd worked at least 60 hours, that there was virtually never a week that he worked less than 60 hours, and that was fairly typical. We saw workers typically working between 6 and 7 days a week. And so what he really should have earned was, in fact, 40 hours at $8.42 an hour and 20 hours of overtime. So quite a bit more. And that comes out to a difference of $341.90 in 1 week. Now, this particular gentleman was here in the United States on an 8-month visa. And so if you do the math, he's clearly being cheated out of a lot of money. And if you do the math across the industry, workers are being cheated out of millions and millions of dollars. And that is really a fairly kind of systematized process. And in fact, the industry now believes that they could not possibly exist without H-2B workers. And that may be true at this point because they've gotten so used to this kind of labor that basically there's an entire industry that exists sort of believing that this is the only way that they can operate. But there's kind of more behind this picture, and there's more that this pay stub does not reveal. It does not reveal that this client, Ugo, paid $2,000 to get this job and was paying his debt each week as he was being cheated out of his wages. Doesn't reveal that he was required to surrender the deed to his home in order to get the job in the United States. And it doesn't reveal that once he filed the lawsuit in the United States, a fairly gutsy and rare thing to do, I would say, for people in this situation, that a group of 7 thugs showed up at his wife's home in Guatemala and threatened to kill him. Threatened to have him deported if he was found, and made a whole host of other kinds of threats against his village. so as a sort of package of abuses, I mean, we were all startled after these threats were made that this was a client who was actually deeply committed to the idea of seeing this case through, and in fact did see the case through. But it took a fairly, I think, extraordinary and gutsy group of people to bring about the reform of this one company, and we're still involved in fighting the battle against just that one relatively small company. So last year we published our report about the guest worker programs and talked about these issues in some detail, and we thought that was important, and I think we thought that we had something to contribute in terms of actually knowing what these programs look like in the real world. And we did actually have a little write-up in the New York Times that was kind of nice. They said nice things about our report, and so we can't say that we didn't ever hit the mainstream press. And I got called a couple times to testify before Congress about some of these issues, and that was sort of nice. But what I think we didn't do, and what we really haven't seen, is that we haven't seen a real reform in the dialogue about immigration, and that's real disheartening. I think that we continue to hear this administration every time there's an ICE raid, which of course it orchestrates and it decides to carry out. But each time immigration shows up at a factory and hauls off a few hundred people or more, we see Chertoff on TV saying, well, see, this is why we need guest worker programs. And really, for the administration, I think there's a very clear link between the deliberate militarization of enforcement and the efforts to drive people into guest worker programs and to drive the reform into guest worker programs. And that's been very explicit by this administration, that has been one of the goals of the enforcement actions. And there, with the sort of idea of driving a wedge in the immigrants' rights community in a lot of ways, so that people who care about how terrible it is to be an undocumented person in the United States right now will be forced to conclude that, well, then guest worker programs are the answer. And I think that continues to be, in many ways, a large part of the sort of overt and understated, not stated part of the debate. And I guess that's certainly something that we'd like to see change over time. And just talk a little bit briefly about some things that have happened since we wrote the report. We filed a case earlier this year on behalf of a group of workers who came to the United States from India. These are workers who were recruited as H-2B workers to do welding in the Gulf Coast. And there's been a real upsurge in use of the guest worker program in the Gulf Coast since Katrina. That's really been in, I think, many employers' mind, the solution to their labor problems. And these workers, hundreds of them, were recruited with really grandiose promises that they would become permanent residents in the United States. And I think the recruiters in that case made a number of bad strategic decisions, one of which was to actually take out newspaper ads and put it in writing that they were promising people permanent residency. I think, but there turns out there was lots of paperwork that said that they were promising people permanent residency and that people needed to come up with $20,000 in order to get these jobs in the United States. Many of these workers had been guest workers in Dubai and other areas in the Middle East. And they were attracted to these offers because they were told that they would be able to bring their family with them, whereas when they were guest workers in Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, they hadn't been able to have their family with them. So many people sold their homes, sold their wife's jewelry, sold everything they had, and borrowed money in order to get the $20,000 to come to work for Signal Corporation. Signal Corporation, who's a who's a subcontractor of some of the largest defense contractors in the United States. And when they got to the United States, they discovered that they were on H-2B contracts, on H-2B visas. These were temporary jobs, and they were going to end. Moreover, Signal had really brought in too many workers, and so began a process of deciding that some of them were going to be retested and found to be not as good welders as they thought, and they were going to send some of them back. So one morning in March of 2007, the company actually sent armed guards into the rooms of some of the workers and told them that they were going to be sent back to India, and they were going to be forcibly put on a plane. They were forcibly detained. One of the workers was so distraught by kind of his personal ruination that he escaped to a bathroom and slit his wrists in an effort to kill himself. He did not succeed, and he's now, in fact, one of the leaders of the kind of organizing movement of this group of workers. But these workers have kind of regularly talked about the level of shame that is associated with being sent back to India with this kind of debt when their lives are basically ruined. And they've said over and over again, if we get sent back, our lives are over. And we are now representing several hundred of these workers in a lawsuit against Signal Corporation and many of the recruiters. So I have to say that although it was nice to get a little splash of notice when we filed the report, it certainly hasn't changed the conditions for workers, I'm sorry to say, in the real world, because this is what we see is ongoing. And so I guess I end on a sorry note, but with some hope that there are changes that could be made in a new administration, and we're certainly hopeful about that, though the history of guest worker programs in the United States does not suggest that there's a significant difference historically between one party or the other in office. These are largely workers who have no political voice. I mean, they obviously they can't vote. Certainly, they're not entitled to vote, and they really don't have any significant advocacy groups in the United States who are causing people to vote on their behalf. And by contrast, when I have gone to testify before Congress, seen hundreds and hundreds of employers waiting in line to get into the hearing rooms. Last time I went, they had to open up a satellite hearing room for all of the employers who had to tell Congress that they couldn't live without this program and that it needed to be expanded. And so if this, if this process and this project is able to kind of send the word out about what these programs look like in practice, I think that will certainly be of benefit to many, many vulnerable people throughout the world. I'm happy to take whatever questions you all have. Yes?
How does this current program, guest workers program, relate to the old Bracero program?
Well, it was created, the original H-2 program coexisted with the Bracero program. So it's been around quite a while, but in the 80s, it was created kind of in its current incarnation. The H-2 program was divided into the H-2A and the H-2B program. And it's actually kind of striking. When you look at the Bracero program, I mean, it is now widely regarded as having been a terrible failure. I mean, you don't find a lot of people who stand up and say, no, that Bracero program, that was a good one, right? No, I mean, people don't say that. Everyone knows that it was terribly abusive and that workers got cheated. But if you look at it on paper, it was pretty progressive. There were a lot of legal protections written in for workers. And somebody described it as one of the best deals that workers had ever gotten. And I think this comes back to the idea that the problem really is structural, that you cannot create a program like this and give so much power, skew the power disparity between worker and employer so dramatically and say, well, of course workers have rights and they can enforce their rights. The truth is, workers in that position cannot realistically enforce their rights. It's unrealistic to expect that they're going to file a class action lawsuit. It's unrealistic to think that the U.S. government is going to do anything about it. And so if there's no real enforcement, then whatever you write on a piece of paper doesn't matter. So I think you'd find that many of the protections for braceros were better than the protections you have. And I think in practice, the programs are woefully similar. Yes? Yeah, that varies. I mean, sometimes, I would say less often than not, it is directly to the employer. More often than not, there are sort of layers of middlemen and recruiters who are involved. And what we often hear from employers is, kind of shock and dismay that workers are paying such money. And when we bring this to an employer's attention, we say, they had to pay $5,000, and the employer said, but I didn't. That wasn't me. We say, but you hired the recruiter, and moreover, you didn't pay the recruiter. That's typically what happens. The employer doesn't pay the recruiter. It's like, did you think he was doing it for free? Because really, in the real world, most people don't do that for free. It's actually kind of a lot of work to go out and recruit a bunch of people and screen them and make sure that they don't have a disqualifying criminal background check, and that they've got whatever kind of experience that you want. So what we've said is employers, for the most part, are on notice at some level that workers are paying for these services. They're certainly paying their own transportation. They're paying for their own visa. They're getting their own passport, and they're generally paying some kind of hiring fee to the recruiter as well. And so, it's a very lucrative occupation to be a recruiter in Mexico or Guatemala. I mean, we describe it as sort of a quasi-criminal army of recruiters who exist. And I think, people work very hard to protect the niches that they have, because it is very lucrative. And some of the examples in our report show recruiters are making hundreds of thousands of dollars from one of these transactions. Arranging for a large group of workers to come to work for one employer. That's a lot of money. Yes.
I'd be curious to hear your assessment of the American farm workers in this whole equation. Are they advocates of farm workers, and you see them as rivals to American-born Mexican workers on those foods and UFW?
Well, that's an interesting question. They have actually been experimenting with having some guest workers from Thailand come in as UFW union employees. And I have to say that although I admire the UFW enormously, I'm really skeptical of that, kind of having their imprimatur on this program, even though I understand that their sort of purpose for doing that is to be able to advocate for workers so that they are less subject to abuse. I think historically, UFW and FLOC, which is a farm labor organizing committee, a kind of Midwestern farm worker union, have been opponents of guest worker programs, and I think that's probably still accurate. For lots of reasons, because they clearly, there's no doubt that these programs undermine wages and working conditions for U.S. workers. There's just no doubt that that's true. There's all sorts of protections on paper to keep that from happening, but in the real world, I don't think there's any question about that.
I had a former student who went into became a lawyer, advocating for farm workers, and he worked for the UFW, and he was fairly frustrated with the lack of success they put their role in the UFW. He didn't think they were falsely moving or having to
Well,
be doing more.
yeah, I think they have tried to. I think what they would say is that they have accepted that these programs are going to exist, and so they're going to try to offer as many protections to workers as they can, and so that's why they've tried to do their own kind of UFW guest worker program where people come in as that. I guess I think strategically that's not the choice that I would make. But I don't doubt that they do it from the perspective of trying to protect workers. So, yes. Yeah, there. Sure. I think what you find for a lot of guest workers, though, is um, that they're very transient, and they're not allowed to bring their families. So I mean, we do have migrant ed. We have kids, migrant kids who are kind of tracked from school to school, and I think those systems work really well for families. I think that what you see in guest worker programs is even more transient than sort of ordinary migrant workers. That workers have very little ties to the community. And for example, you see with the forestry workers, I've had workers who say, I have no idea what state I'm in. And they go outside and I say, what does it say outside? And they say, Rose Motel. I'm like, okay. And they literally don't know. I mean, they get hauled in, they work somewhere a few weeks, and they don't, so I think in that context, it would be really hard to expect, you know, um, migrant services to figure that out, to get in there to provide services before they're, hauled off to the next place. Excuse me. Hmm.
Is there a limit in on these visas?
There's
Limited number?
yes.
So how do the companies, how do they compete for being providing these visas?
There is no limit to the number of H-2A workers, agricultural workers, who can be brought in. Excuse me. There is a limit to the number of H-2B workers who can be brought in, and that's capped now at 66,000. It was actually there was a system several years ago where it was people who had come before were exempt against the cap, and so there were as many as 125,000 people coming in. It was growing, and then that sunsetted. That was a temporary provision. So essentially now what happens is it's first in time. The first, there's a date on which they start accepting H-2B applications, and when they hit the cap, they don't get any more.
For the next year, for the next...
It's done in 6-month increments, so it's October and then again in April. And so what that means is that people now are just completely misrepresenting the amount of time that people will be spending in the United States, because they can't apply until it has to be a certain window of the time when the work will be performed. But if they wait until they actually should apply, then the cap will have been reached. So there's this kind of whole skewed process where people are like rushing to apply. If you don't apply within the first few days, you won't get workers anymore. And so there's a very strong, this is actually one of the hearings that I was at, where there were just hundreds and hundreds of employers with these buttons that say lift the cap. And there are a number of senators. Barbara Mikulski, who's a Democratic senator from Maryland, is one of the leaders in pushing to have the cap lifted, because the seafood industry in her state relies upon crab pickers. And I've heard, she'll get up there and she'll say, well, these companies, they couldn't live without these workers. And I represented lots of seafood processors when I was in Virginia, and I never met a seafood processor who made legal wages that she was entitled to, and most of those workers are women. So I don't think that it's not one party or the other. They're sort of advocating these things.
And then the other question I have is, does it also include computer and software?
No, that's the H-1B program, which is a controversial program in its own right. So that's a much larger program, and it's different to the extent that workers can change from one H-1B employer to another H-1B employer in so long as it happens in a certain time frame and in a certain way. But it has also been criticized by scholars who say that that it has led to a lot of abuses. I would say on balance, I know less about this program. We don't represent those workers because they're not sort of typically the most desperately poor, but they do tend to be paid a lot less than computer programmers who are not H-1B workers. Yes?
You mentioned the labor department as a large sector of the program. Is that because um, they're so dependent on the employer, or is that because they really have the power?
I think it's because they are not real smart and don't read the law. Because we wrote a long sort of analysis for them about why that was wrong and why they are clearly empowered to do that. And they were unpersuaded by what I thought was, highly persuasive legal argument. So I think they lack the will under any circumstance. I mean, in the H-2A program, there's no doubt that they have the legal authority to go out there and enforce, protect people's rights, and they really don't do it. So, I mean, whether they have the authority or not, I don't think workers can count on them.
Was it the government? I didn't hear the question. Was he asking if government
Right,
before
it's the Labor Department.
Yeah.
Yes?
I saw in your article from the Project Censored website, your conclusion gave 3 ideas to expand the H2 program, but you didn't suggest scrapping it altogether. Um, should I interpret that as meaning the H2 program is so essential to the United States economy that it should continue to be implemented even in its terribly mismanaged?
No, 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 no. And I think that that was a summary of a sort of larger piece. I think our position would be that we think this is a bad program, that we do not think this program should be expanded, and it should not currently exist as it is. That being said, we understand the political realities, and there's no real political will to get rid of the program. And so we did offer kind of specific technical suggestions, I think, to make it better, to make it less abusive in practice. I think, we actually had a great internal debate about whether we should do that. And is it better to just say the program stinks? But we felt like the program will continue to exist, and it's really unconscionable that more than 20 years after the program existed, there are no regulations to protect H-2B workers. And so we thought that there were really very clear and specific things that should be done while the program exists. And so I think that's kind of why we're talking, on really two very different levels. One is, we wouldn't cry if the program was scrapped. But while it's here, we should, at a fundamental level, they could, the government could limit what people pay and make employers responsible for recruitment costs. They could make visas portable from one employer to another and say, if you get treated bad, you can go work for any other, employer. And that would make a huge difference, I think, in terms of people's ability to feel free. Yes. You tell me when I shouldn't take any more questions. Okay.
Is there any indication that the so-called Homeland Security apparatus is helping these companies look out for dissent and uprisings, or is it just the company security that's responding to any of that?
Oh, no, I think we definitely see law enforcement involved at various levels in nefarious ways. I mean, for example, in some cases we have people being picked up when they are out of status because an employer calls them and say, hey, this guy ran off and now he's out of status. We see the local police involved, generally on the side of employers, in really nefarious ways. So I think across the board, we see that the government is not, excuse me, is playing one role, and that is, to protect the rights of employers.
So it's the 18th century model all around.
Oh, yes, all around.